Up to this point, we've focused quite a bit on history, both in terms of the historical perspectives on psychopathology and historical theories that guide the conceptualization and treatment of mental disorders. Now we're going to turn to more current theories that guide the conceptualization and treatment of mental disorders. Before we get started there, I want to reiterate a really important point that was made in your book regarding the utility of psychological theories. As your book mentioned, there are a number of different theories that guide clinical psychology. Rather than theories, the word that your book uses is paradigms, and the authors define paradigms as the conceptual framework or approach that defines how to conceptualize and study a subject, how to gather and interpret relevant data, and even how to think about a particular subject. These paradigms or theories play a crucial role in the study and treatment of mental disorders because they not only seek to explain why people might experience symptoms, but also, based on those definitions, how we should treat people in order to ameliorate symptoms and improve quality of life. Now, there are an unlimited number of theories in the field of psychology. We talked about two last week, psychoanalytic and behavioral. Even though we describe those two theories as historical, they're still used today, and many people practice from those perspectives. In addition to those theories, there are some others that we'll talk about in these online lectures, including perspectives about genetic, neurobiological, and cognitive behavioral perspectives. However, it's also really important that you realize that there are a host of other theories that are also used to guide client conceptualization and treatment that aren't talked about in your book, but are extremely important, like humanistic and existential perspectives, family systems perspectives, feminist and multicultural perspectives, solution-focused therapy. There's a whole list. I'll spend a bit of time talking about the humanistic perspective, and then we'll spend some time talking about other theories in class. But other than that, we're not really going to take much time in this class on those topics. If you're interested in learning more about those and how they affect treatment, then you'll have to take one of my other classes, which is Counseling Theories and Processes. So let's get started. So, as I mentioned, there are a lot of different theories about the causes and therefore resulting treatments of psychological disorders. Although it is the case that a lot of people use one of those theories in order to guide their practice, when we're trying to understand the etiology or cause of psychological disorders, thinking from a singular perspective won't actually get us that far. Instead, we have to think multidimensionally, acknowledging that symptoms are developed through a combination of multiple factors. So when you're conceptualizing the factors that contribute to psychological disorders, you want to think from what we would call a biopsychosocial cultural perspective. The bio includes the genetic and neuroscience paradigms. The psycho involves behavioral, cognitive behavioral, psychoanalytic theories, amongst others. The social is just what it says, relationships with friends and family members and forms of social learning. And the cultural piece acknowledges how cultural practices and norms shape the development and expression of symptoms. Let's start with the biological piece. The basic assumption of the biological paradigm is that biology plays a role in pathological behavior, and that, at least in part, psychopathology is caused by disease. As your book mentioned, there are two main paradigms that fall under this heading. There's the genetic paradigm, as well as the neuroscience paradigm. Let's start with the genetic paradigm first. Now, as I mentioned in previous lectures, the idea that genetics may be linked to psychological disorders isn't a new idea. As far back as the mid-300s BC, Aristotle hypothesized that symptoms might run in families, and then in the late 1800s, Galton was all over that, founder of the genetic movement. However, if you also recall, that knowledge didn't do much for us in terms of treatment, because there was this sense, particularly in the early 1900s, that if mental illness ran in your family, you were more or less doomed, that genes were the thing that caused symptoms and there was no getting away from it. Thankfully, we know that is no longer true, because what the genetic paradigm has taught us is that although genetics certainly play a role in psychological disorders and symptoms overall, the way they do so is complex. So we know, for example, that most psychological disorders are polygenic, meaning they're caused by several different genes, perhaps operating at different times during the course of development. We also know that, as your book mentioned, genes do their work through the environment. So we can think about genes as affecting the environment and about the environment as affecting genes. And this happens through a number of different ways. So we know that the proteins genes themselves produce can cause other genes to turn on and off, a process your book calls gene expression. We also know that both shared and non-shared environmental factors, so factors that family members living in the same household all experience and unique experiences that people have, can turn on and turn off different genes, something referred to as epigenetics. And I have to say that I find epigenetics fascinating because in many ways the field of epigenetics has really transformed how we think about the relationship between nature, in this case genetics, and nurture or experience. So here's the deal with epigenetics. We can think of epigenetics as the study of the cellular and physiological phenotypic trait variations that are caused by external or environmental factors that switch genes on and off and affect how cells read genes instead of being caused by changes in the DNA sequence. In other words, it's the way that experiences affect gene expression. This is a relatively new area of study, so there's a lot that we're still figuring out. But what we've discovered is fascinating, how even across generations, experiences, particularly in terms of stress, can end up affecting gene expression. The other paradigm that falls under the heading of biological influences on psychopathology is the neuroscience paradigm. And what the neuroscience paradigm asserts is that processes in the brain, at least in part, cause psychological disorders. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail here about the basic structure of the brain. There's a very brief review in your book, and there are many, many classes you can take on that, which I'd strongly encourage you to do. But it is important that you know that according to the neuroscience paradigm, psychological disorders can be caused by both brain structure, so the physical shape of the brain, and brain function, particularly in terms of neurotransmitters. Let's talk about brain structure first. So what we know is that brain development is an extremely precise and complex process, and that mishaps can happen along the way. A lot of times, eccentricities in brain development are unnoticed. They have no appreciable effect on functioning. But at other times, these missteps can significantly affect outcomes. For example, research has shown that individuals who experience symptoms of schizophrenia also have enlarged ventricles. Although it's not known whether the enlarged ventricles cause symptoms or if the symptoms cause the ventricles to enlarge, a relationship has been found. And that's just one example of how brain structure affects psychological disorders. The other piece of the neuroscience paradigm is about the function of the brain, particularly in terms of the functioning of neurotransmitters. And you can think about neurotransmitters as chemical messengers that are released from the presynaptic neuron into the synapse. In general, research has shown that either too much or too little of the neurotransmitters dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, and GABA have been linked with psychological disorders. The process by which we end up with too much or too little of a particular neurotransmitter is multifaceted, with symptoms resulting from maybe too much or too little of a specific neurotransmitter due to changes in the synthesis of the transmitter, too much of a specific neurotransmitter due to changes in the reuptake of the transmitter, having too many or too few receptors on the postsynaptic neuron membrane, and also neurotransmitter imbalances in different or interacting neural circuits. As we go through the various disorders, we'll talk about the role of different neurotransmitters. But overall, what we know is that serotonin, which is involved in thought, emotion, behavior, and inhibition, and dopamine, which is responsible for exploratory, pleasure-seeking behaviors, may be involved in depression, mania, and schizophrenia. Norepinephrine, which works on alpha and beta adrenergic receptors, may be involved in anxiety disorders and other stress-related conditions, and GABA, which primarily works to inhibit nerve impulses, seems to be involved in anxiety disorders. As a result of this knowledge, and as your book mentions, the use of psychoactive drugs to treat psychological disorders has increased rapidly over the past few decades. So this chart is for ADHD medication prescriptions alone, which show that between 2001 and 2010, the number of ADHD medication prescriptions has risen from about 0.5 or 0.6% of U.S. adults to more than 1.8%. And overall, we've seen that prescriptions for psychiatric problems in adults have risen 22% since 2001. Although psychotropic medications can be extremely helpful to a lot of people, this medication culture that we have in the U.S. is also fairly problematic. I say that because if you remember at the beginning of the lecture, I mentioned that we need to take a multidimensional approach to conceptualizing mental illnesses, recognizing that it's not any one thing that causes symptoms. But if we're only treating symptoms using psychotropic meds, which is very frequently the case, that's exactly what we're doing. We're ignoring the psychosocial cultural factors that cause mental illness that therefore should also be addressed in treatment. And I'll spend quite a bit of time on that soapbox throughout the semester, so I'll stop there for now. But just one last piece about the neuroscience paradigm, and then we'll move on. Your book also mentions the neuroendocrine system and the immune system as relevant to psychopathology. In some ways, the neuroendocrine system ends up affecting the immune system because, as your book reviews, the neuroendocrine system is responsible for regulating stress, the stress hormone cortisol, and cortisol has been shown to have a profound effect on the immune system. Again, as we start to talk more about specific disorders, we'll review these systems as they become relevant. So that's the biological piece of the biopsychosocial cultural model. In the next video, we'll move on to the psychological piece.